Today, if you ask someone to describe the 10 plagues of Egypt, they usually imagine a children's book. We see a chaotic list of disasters: frogs hopping into beds, gnats swarming in the air, a bad hailstorm, locusts eating the crops. When we read it like this, it looks like God simply reached into the sky and threw down the most annoying, disruptive, and destructive things he could think of just to break a king's stubbornness. It feels like a display of raw, unfocused power. It feels random, but it is not. When you look closely at the history, the culture, and the religious imagination of the ancient world, you realize the biblical text is doing something much deeper. The plagues were not just a sequence of ecological disasters. They were a targeted, precise, and devastating theological war. To understand this, we have to understand how Egypt saw the world. Egypt was not just a political superpower. It was a deeply religious empire where the physical and the spiritual were completely woven together. To the ancient Egyptian mind, nothing was secular. Every part of their reality, the river, the soil, the harvest, the sky, the sun, was not just nature, it was divine. They worshipped a massive pantheon of gods, and each deity was believed to hold an exact domain over the earth. There was a god of the water, a goddess of the crops, a god of the sky, and a god of medicine. And holding all of this together was Pharaoh himself. Pharaoh was not just a king or a political leader. He was considered the living incarnation of a god, tasked with maintaining the cosmic order of the universe. So, when Moses walks into the throne room and says to let his people go, he is not just making a labor demand. He is challenging the entire spiritual architecture of the greatest empire on earth. He is walking into the house of the gods and claiming that they have no authority over these Hebrew slaves. And God tells Israel exactly what is happening behind the scenes. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 12, God says, "Against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord." That single sentence changes how we read the entire story. God was not just punishing a cruel dictator. He was dismantling the Egyptian pantheon, piece by piece, god by god. We also have to remember who else was watching this happen. The Israelites had lived in this system for 400 years. 400 years is a very long time to live under the shadow of someone else's gods. Generation after generation, the Hebrews woke up to the statues of Egyptian deities. They built monuments to Egyptian power. They watched the priests of Egypt perform their rituals. It would have been incredibly easy for a Hebrew slave to believe that Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was silent, or weak, or simply absent. So God is not just trying to force Pharaoh to sign a release form. He is performing an act of spiritual rescue for the minds of his own people. Before he can lead Israel out of Egypt, he has to take the fear of Egypt out of Israel. He does this by pulling down the false pillars of their world, showing both the oppressors and the oppressed who actually holds the universe together. If you only read the plagues as a list of natural disasters, you miss the actual battle. Every frog, every fly, and every dark hour was a direct insult to a specific Egyptian deity. Yahweh was walking into the domains of the most feared gods of the ancient world and proving that they had no power at all. This sequence was not random. It was an architectural dismantling of an empire. But to understand how precise this judgment was, we cannot start by looking at the sky. We have to go to the very source of Egyptian life. We have to go to the water. If you want to understand ancient Egypt, you have to look at the Nile. It was not just a river. It was the spine of the empire. In a land surrounded by brutal, unforgiving desert, the Nile was the only reason Egypt existed. It watered the crops. It provided the food. It functioned as the great highway for trade and communication. But the Egyptians did not just see the river as a massive geographical feature. They saw it as a living, divine entity. Specifically, they worshipped a deity named Hapi. Hapi was the spirit of the Nile, the god who brought the annual floods that made the soil rich and green. To the Egyptian mind, Hapi was the ultimate bringer of life and provision. Later, Egyptian tradition also associated the river with Osiris, the god of the underworld and rebirth. In their ancient mythology, the waters of the Nile were sometimes thought of as the very bloodstream of Osiris, giving life to the nation. The river was sacred. It was life itself. So it is not a coincidence that the first major confrontation begins exactly here. In Exodus chapter 7, God tells Moses to go down to the water in the morning. He does not send Moses to the throne room. He sends him to the riverbank, exactly when Pharaoh is walking out to the water. Many historians and scholars suggest Pharaoh was likely not just taking a morning stroll. He was likely performing a daily religious ritual. As the living incarnation of the gods, his job was to honor the river and maintain the cosmic order between the heavens and the land. And right there, in the middle of this deeply sacred space, Moses raises his staff, he strikes the water, and the mighty Nile turns to blood. This is not just a bizarre magic trick, and it is not just a severe ecological disaster. It is a theological execution. God is taking the very source of Egyptian life and turning it into a river of death. He is walking right into the domain of Hapi and showing that this supposed God of provision has absolutely no power to protect his own waters. The text tells us the fish die. The river stinks. The lifeline of the greatest empire on earth becomes entirely undrinkable. But there is another layer to this judgment, one that is deeply rooted in biblical memory. Decades earlier, a previous pharaoh had issued a brutal decree. To control the growing Hebrew population, he ordered that every newborn Hebrew boy be thrown into the Nile River. The Egyptians had turned their sacred river into a silent graveyard for Israelite children. Now, God is revealing the dark truth of what Egypt has done. The river turns violently red. The water literally reflects the blood of the innocent. It is a profound and terrifying display of divine justice. What Egypt used to secretly murder God's people has now become a visible source of death for Egypt itself. In a moment of supreme irony, the text says the magicians of Egypt managed to replicate this act on a small scale. But notice what they are doing. Instead of purifying the water, they only add to the destruction. They have the dark power to make the problem worse, but they are completely powerless to reverse what Yahweh has done. The supreme river god had fallen. Pharaoh's sacred morning ritual was shattered. The first pillar of the Egyptian worldview had collapsed. But this was only the beginning. The judgment was not going to stay contained within the riverbanks. God had struck the water. But the text shows us that the judgment was about to crawl out of the river and walk directly into their homes. The river had become a grave, but the judgment was not going to stay in the water. It was about to invade the most intimate spaces of Egyptian life. When the second plague begins, millions of frogs emerge from the Nile. They swarm into the houses, into the bedrooms, into the ovens, and into the kneading bowls. To a modern reader, this sounds like a bizarre nuisance, but to an ancient Egyptian, it was a theological nightmare. In the Egyptian pantheon, there was a powerful goddess named Heqet. She was the goddess of fertility, childbirth, and life. And in Egyptian art, she was constantly depicted with the head of a frog. Because frogs multiplied so rapidly after the annual floods, they were the ultimate symbol of life and abundance. In fact, frogs were so sacred in ancient Egypt that it was a crime to kill one. So look at what the biblical text is showing us. God is not just sending pests. He is taking one of their most sacred symbols of fertility and multiplying it until it becomes a suffocating curse. He gives them exactly what they worship, but he gives it to them in such massive volume that they are begging for it to stop. The symbol of life becomes a rotting stench in their streets. The goddess Heqet is rendered completely useless. Then, the judgment moves from the water to the soil. In Exodus chapter 8, God tells Aaron to strike the dust of the earth. When he does, the dust turns into swarms of gnats, covering both people and animals. This was a direct assault on Geb, the ancient Egyptian god of the earth. The ground itself, the very soil they worshipped and depended on, was suddenly weaponized against them. But there is a crucial shift that happens right here in the narrative. Up until this point, the Egyptian magicians had been able to mimic the plagues on a tiny scale. They had used their dark arts to copy the blood and copy the frogs. But when the dust turns to gnats, their power runs out. They try to replicate the plague, and they completely fail. And they turn to Pharaoh and say, "This is the finger of God." The spiritual advisors of the empire are the first to break. They realize they are no longer dealing with a regional deity. They are dealing with a power that holds the very dust of the earth in his hands. But Pharaoh refuses to listen. So the swarms escalate. The fourth plague brings thick, devastating clouds of flies. Some scholars connect this swarm to Khepri, a god of creation depicted as a flying beetle, or to other gods associated with insects. But what matters most in this plague is not just the swarm itself, it is the boundary line. For the first time, God explicitly divides the land. He sends the swarms to ruin the houses of the Egyptians, but he places an invisible shield of protection over the region of Goshen, where the Israelite slaves live. This detail is massive. It proves to both Egypt and Israel that this is not a random ecological collapse. A natural disaster does not stop at a border. A natural disaster does not avoid a specific neighborhood. This is the sovereign creator aiming his judgment with absolute precision. He is dismantling the oppressors while standing guard over his people. The magicians had retreated. The earth was swarming. The gods of the ground had been humiliated. But the next wave of judgment would strike something even more vital to Egypt's survival. It was about to strike their wealth and their health. God had ruined the water. He had infested the soil. But a nation can survive a poisoned river and a swarming earth if its wealth remains secure. So, in Exodus chapter 9, the judgment moves from the ground to the economy. God sends a deadly plague against the livestock of Egypt. The horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks are suddenly struck down in the fields. To modern readers, this sounds like an agricultural tragedy. But to an ancient empire, this was a total economic collapse. Livestock was not just food. It was currency. It was labor. It was transportation. The death of the horses alone was a devastating blow to the military machine of the empire. But like every plague before it, this was not just about economics. It was deeply theological. The Egyptian pantheon was filled with animal deities, particularly bovine gods. Hathor, one of the most important and beloved goddesses in Egypt, was the goddess of love, joy, and maternal care. She was consistently depicted in the form of a cow. And then there was the Apis bull. In Egyptian religion, the Apis bull was not just a symbol. A living, breathing bull was kept in the temple and worshipped as the physical manifestation of the divine. It represented strength, kingship, and divine favor. When the livestock of Egypt died in the fields, Yahweh was making a profound statement. The sacred bulls could not protect themselves. The mother goddess of care could not keep her own herds alive. The gods of strength were lying dead in the dirt. And once again, the text adds a brilliant, agonizing detail for Pharaoh. God draws a line in the pasture. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one animal belonging to the Israelites was touched. But Pharaoh hardens his heart. So the judgment moves from the wealth of the nation to the health of the nation. God tells Moses to take handfuls of soot from a furnace and throw it into the air before Pharaoh. As the fine dust scatters, it breaks out into festering boils on the people and the animals. That detail about the furnace is not random. Later in Scripture, the biblical writers refer to Egypt as the iron furnace, the place of brutal, burning slavery. Moses takes the very ash of their oppression and throws it back over the empire. The symbol of Hebrew suffering becomes the source of Egyptian agony. This was a direct strike against the Egyptian gods of medicine and healing. Egypt was famous in the ancient world for its medical knowledge. They worshipped deities associated with magic and healing, like Imhotep, the god of medicine, and Sekhmet, the goddess who was believed to have the power to both bring and cure disease. But in Exodus chapter 9, the medical system completely fails. In one of the most humiliating sentences in the entire narrative, the text tells us that the magicians could not even stand before Moses because of the boils. Pause for a second and look at that image. These are the spiritual and medical elite of the empire. They are the men who speak for the gods. They are the protectors of the realm, but they are so crippled by the judgment of Yahweh that they cannot even stand on their own 2 feet in the royal court. The water was dead. The earth was swarming. Egypt's wealth was dying in the fields, and their priests could not even stand up because of the boils. But the judgment was about to look up. The skies over Egypt were about to tear open. Pause for a second and see what has emerged. So far, this has not been a random sequence of chaotic events. The word of God appeared first in the water, then moved into the soil, and then struck the economy. Yahweh has systematically dismantled the gods of the river, the gods of fertility, and the gods of healing. The pattern is clear, precise, and deliberate. But the judgment does not stop at the ground. It is time for the destruction to move upward. Yahweh is preparing to challenge the gods of the atmosphere. In ancient Egypt, the sky was not just an empty expanse of blue. It was the physical domain of Nut, the great sky goddess. In Egyptian art, Nut was often depicted as a massive woman arching her body completely over the earth. She served as a divine canopy. Her entire purpose was to protect the land of Egypt from cosmic chaos and destruction raining down from the heavens. Then there was Seth. Seth was a terrifying, chaotic deity, recognized as the Lord of storms, thunder, and disorder. For centuries, the Egyptians believed that as long as Nut stood guard and Seth was appeased, the skies over the empire would remain secure. Then comes Exodus chapter 9. God tells Moses to stretch out his hand toward the sky. What follows is a storm unlike anything the ancient world had ever recorded. God sends a massive barrage of hail, accompanied by fire flashing continuously in the midst of the ice. This was not merely extreme weather. This was a theological statement. The elements of fire and ice, which should naturally cancel each other out, are working together in terrifying obedience to the God of the Hebrews. Nut, the great protective canopy, is torn wide open. She offers absolutely no shelter. Seth, the mighty Lord of storms, is completely overpowered in his own element. Yahweh is proving that he alone commands the atmosphere, but there is a detail right before the storm hits that is completely unexpected. It changes how we view the entire plague's narrative. God issues a warning. Through Moses, God tells Pharaoh's officials to bring their servants and their remaining livestock indoors. He explicitly warns them that anything left in the open field will be struck down and die. Notice what the text is doing here. In the middle of bringing down an empire, God is actively providing a way of escape for his enemies. This is not blind, reckless rage. It is a calculated judgment that leaves room for mercy. God is giving the Egyptians a choice. Will they continue to trust their collapsing pantheon, or will they finally fear the word of Yahweh? The text tells us that some of Pharaoh's officials had finally seen enough. Those who feared the word of the Lord hurried their servants and animals into the houses, but those who still ignored the warning left them standing in the field. When the storm broke, the devastation was absolute. The hail struck down everything in the open. The flax and the barley were ruined. Every tree in the field was shattered. But the Egyptians who submitted to the word of Yahweh survived. God was showing that life was no longer found under the protection of the Egyptian gods. Life was only found in trusting his voice. And once again, the narrative gives us a profound boundary line. While fire and ice destroyed the empire, the text says that in the land of Goshen, where the sons of Israel lived, there was no hail. The sky over the Hebrews remained perfectly, miraculously calm. The hail shattered the trees and the crops. It seemed like the land could not take any more devastation. But whatever the hail left behind, the next wind was going to devour. The storm of fire and ice had shattered the empire. The flax was ruined. The barley was destroyed. The trees were broken. But the text in Exodus gives us a tiny, easily missed detail. The wheat and the spelt had survived. They were late crops, so they had not yet broken through the ground when the hail fell. For the Egyptians, this meant there was still a sliver of hope. They had lost almost everything, but they had not lost their final harvest. They would not starve. But the judgment of Yahweh is thorough. In Exodus chapter 10, God announces the 8th plague. He brings an east wind that blows across the land all day and all night. And when the morning comes, the wind brings the locusts. To an ancient society, a locust swarm was not just an insect problem. It was an apocalyptic event. A massive swarm can consume tens of thousands of tons of vegetation in a single day. But to the Egyptian mind, this was another devastating theological defeat. Egypt relied on deities to guarantee the harvest. They worshipped Min, the god of agriculture and crops, who was supposed to ensure the abundance of the fields. They venerated Isis, one of the most powerful figures in their religion, who was deeply tied to the life-giving power of the earth and the protection of the food supply. But when the east wind stopped blowing, Min and Isis were completely powerless. The biblical text describes the swarm in terrifying terms. The locusts covered the face of the earth so entirely that the ground itself was blackened. They descended on the fields and devoured every surviving plant. They stripped the fruit from the shattered trees. When the swarm finally settled, the narrator gives us a haunting summary. Not a single green thing remained on the trees or the plants in all the land of Egypt. The breadbasket of the ancient world had been completely erased. The gods of the harvest had failed to protect a single blade of grass. This is where the psychological toll on the empire reaches a breaking point. Even Pharaoh's own officials beg him to surrender. They look at the king and ask, "Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" Pharaoh calls for Moses and Aaron in a panic. But notice the specific language he uses. He does not just ask them to pray for the bugs to leave. He says, "Forgive my sin just this once, and pray to the Lord your God to take this deadly plague away from me." In the original language, the phrase is much more blunt. Pharaoh asks God to remove only this death. The king of Egypt, the man who believed he was a living God, looks out the window of his palace and realizes that his entire domain has been uncreated. The river of life was a river of blood. The soil was swarming, the livestock were rotting in the fields, the sky was broken, and the crops were entirely gone. Egypt was reduced to a desolate wasteland. The false gods of nature had been silenced. The green of the land was gone. The food was gone. But God was not finished. He was about to aim at the very center of Egyptian religion. He was preparing to strike the pinnacle of their pantheon. The green of the land was gone. The food was gone. But God was not finished. He was about to aim at the very center of Egyptian religion. He was preparing to strike the pinnacle of their pantheon. In the ancient world, no deity was more worshipped, more feared, and more exalted than the sun. In Egypt, the sun was not just a celestial body. It was Amun-Ra. Amun-Ra was the supreme god of the empire. He was considered the creator of the universe, the giver of life, and the king of the gods. Every single day, when the sun rose over the Nile, it was believed to be Amun-Ra moving across the sky in his golden boat, victorious over the forces of chaos and darkness. Because Pharaoh was the living incarnation of the gods, his deepest connection was to Amun-Ra. The king of Egypt was often called the son of Ra. The entire theology and stability of the empire were built on the guarantee that the sun would always rise. Then comes the 9th plague. In Exodus chapter 10, God tells Moses to stretch out his hand toward the sky. The text says that a thick darkness came over all the land of Egypt for 3 days. But this was not just an eclipse, and it was not just a heavy dust storm. The biblical text uses a very specific, terrifying phrase. It calls it a darkness that can be felt. Pause and imagine the psychological horror of that moment. For 3 entire days, the sun simply does not rise. The supreme god of the Egyptian empire has been completely blacked out. Amun-Ra is dead in the sky. The text tells us the darkness was so heavy, so absolute, that people could not see one another. No one left their place for 3 days. The great Egyptian empire, the civilization of monuments and absolute power, was paralyzed in the dark. They could not move. They could not work. They could not even light a fire to push the shadow back. Yahweh had suffocated the light of the empire. This was the ultimate humiliation. God was showing that the highest power in the Egyptian pantheon was absolutely nothing before the God of Abraham. Amun-Ra could not pierce the darkness. He could not defend his own sky. The daily victory of the sun had been canceled by the word of Yahweh. But once again, the text gives us a profound boundary line. While the greatest empire on earth was paralyzed in absolute, suffocating terror, the narrator casually mentions one final detail. All the sons of Israel had light in their dwellings. This is not just a physical miracle. It is a stunning theological reversal. The slaves have the light. The masters are in the dark. God is visibly separating the two nations, preparing his people for the final act of rescue. Pharaoh is pushed to his absolute limit. He summons Moses and tells him to leave, but he tries to keep the Israelite livestock as a final bargaining chip. Moses refuses. Not a single hoof will be left behind. In his rage, Pharaoh screams at Moses to get out. He tells Moses that the day he sees his face again, he will die. Moses replies calmly, "You have spoken correctly. I shall never see your face again." The sun had died for 3 days. The supreme god of Egypt was silenced. There was only one false god left to judge, and he was sitting on the throne. The sun had finally returned, but the empire was already dead. There was only one false god left to judge, and he was sitting on the throne. To understand the final plague, you have to understand the theology of the Egyptian crown. Pharaoh was not merely a political dictator. He was worshipped as the living incarnation of the god Horus. He was the earthly son of Amun-Ra. The primary duty of Pharaoh was to maintain a sacred concept the Egyptians called Ma'at. Ma'at meant truth, balance, order, and cosmic harmony. Pharaoh's supreme job was to stand between his people and the forces of chaos. As long as Pharaoh was on the throne, The river would flow, the crops would grow, and the sun would rise. But over the last 9 plagues, Yahweh had systematically destroyed Ma'at. He had invited chaos into every corner of the empire, and the living God on the throne had been completely powerless to stop it. Now, God was preparing to strike the dynasty itself. In Exodus chapter 11, God announces the 10th plague. At midnight, every firstborn in the land of Egypt will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive in the dungeon. This was not just a tragic loss of life. It was a theological decapitation. Pharaoh's firstborn son was not just a royal prince. He was the heir to the divine throne. He was the next incarnate God. By striking the firstborn, Yahweh was severing the divine lineage of Egypt. He was proving that the king of the gods could not even keep his own son breathing in his own palace. But the 10th plague also brings a profound shift in how God deals with Israel. In the previous plagues, God used geography to protect his people. He simply kept the swarms and the hail out of the land of Goshen. But for the final judgment, geography is no longer enough. The judgment of death is sweeping across the entire land, and this time, the Israelites are not automatically exempt just because of where they live. They have to make a choice. God institutes the Passover. He tells every Hebrew family to take a spotless lamb, sacrifice it, and paint its blood on the doorposts of their houses. When the judgment moves through the land at midnight, it will only pass over the homes marked by the blood. The boundary line is no longer a border. The boundary line is faith in the word of Yahweh. At midnight, the final blow falls. The text tells us that a great cry went up in Egypt, for there was not a single house without someone dead. The absolute devastation of that moment is hard to comprehend. The gods of the river had failed. The gods of the earth had failed. The gods of the sky had failed. And now, the living God of the empire was holding his dead son in the dark. Pharaoh is finally broken. He summons Moses and Aaron in the middle of the night. There are no more conditions. There are no more arrogant questions about who Yahweh is. Pharaoh simply tells them to rise up, take the flocks, take the herds, and get out from among his people. And then, the shattered king of Egypt says one final thing to Moses. He says, "And bless me also." The man who believed he was the sovereign Lord of the earth is reduced to begging for a blessing from the leaders of the slaves he used to beat. The reversal is absolute. The pantheon is empty. Yahweh alone is God. Pharaoh was finally broken. The gods of Egypt had been systematically dismantled. But as the Israelites walked out of Egypt, we realized this sequence was doing something far deeper than just destroying a nation. The Israelites walked out of Egypt under a calm, unbroken sky. Behind them lay the silent ruins of the greatest superpower in the ancient world. But if we only look at the physical destruction of the land, we miss the actual masterpiece of the Exodus. The 10 plagues were not just a list of punishments. They were an act of profound theological uncreation. Think about the pattern we just walked through. In Genesis chapter 1, God created a world of absolute order. He separated the waters. He made the dry land appear. He filled the sky with light. He brought forth the plants, the animals, and humanity. He established a cosmic rhythm of life, peace, and flourishing. But Egypt had taken God's good creation and weaponized it. They had used the river to secretly murder Hebrew children. They had turned human beings into disposable property. They worshipped the creation instead of the Creator, building an entire civilization on the illusion that Pharaoh and his false gods maintained the order of the universe. So Yahweh stepped in and uncreated their world. He turned the water of life into a river of blood. He made the dust of the earth swarm with disease. He broke the protective canopy of the sky with fire and ice. He stripped the ground of every green thing. And finally, he blotted out the sun itself. God systematically reversed the sequence of Genesis. He brought the empire of oppression all the way back to darkness, emptiness, and chaos. He proved to the most powerful men on earth that every god they trusted was a myth, and every security they built was a shadow. But God did not dismantle Egypt just to leave the world in ruin. He dismantled the false gods so he could build something completely new. The Exodus was never just a political rescue mission. It was a new creation story. As the Israelites stepped out of their houses on that final morning, marked by the blood of the Passover lamb, they were no longer just a collection of terrified slaves. They were a new nation. They were stepping into a new world, entirely separated from the idols of their past. and belonging completely to the one true God. The boundary line was no longer drawn by an empire. The boundary line was drawn by faith in the blood of the Lamb. When you read the story of the plagues today, do not read it as a chaotic list of ancient disasters. Read it as the fierce, deliberate love of a God who will go to war against the most powerful systems on earth to rescue his people. He does not just defeat our enemies. He exposes the false gods we have been living under, so that the fear of the world is broken, and we can finally see him clearly. If this journey through the Exodus has helped you see Scripture with fresh eyes, consider subscribing so you do not miss our next study. The plagues of Egypt were never just a list of disasters. They were the quiet architecture of redemption.